In the early morning hours of April 18th, 1906, the 410,000 residents of the town of San Francisco, California, awoke to minor shaking that lasted only for a few seconds. 30 seconds later, however, the town was struck by an earthquake measuring 7.9 on the Richter scale. The shaking lasted almost a full minute and was felt from Oregon to LA and as far east as Nevada. What happened next would not only change the face of the city of San Francisco and cause a market panic and subsequent economic recession, but also permanently shape the development of the West. San Francisco is no stranger to strong quakes. As far back as the 17th century, records show a quake measuring more than 7.0 on the Richter scale popping up every decade or so. No earthquake in the area, before or since, however, has been more powerful than the 1906 quake. After the main shock tore through the city, it toppled buildings, buckled roads and trolley tracks, and drove people out into the streets in droves for fear that the roofs over their heads would collapse onto them. The troubles were only beginning, however, for the people of San Francisco. Soon, fires began to spread from severed gas lines and overturned oil lamps, and the city's primarily wooden buildings caught like dry tinder. Over the course of the next 72 hours, fires would rage throughout the city. People looked on helplessly as their homes and businesses caught and then went up in flames. Complicating matters, the fire chief was critically injured in the initial quake and later died of his injuries. The interim fire chief, with the magnitude of the disaster ahead of him becoming more and more clear, quickly phoned the U.S. Army base on the edge of the city with an urgent request for both aid and explosives. The San Francisco Fire Department intended to demolish buildings to build fire breaks in the path of the conflagration ripping through the city. The U.S. Army agreed to help and quickly dispatched troops to begin relief efforts. Meanwhile, people began to think about their circumstances, and in particular, how they would financially recover from this. It turns out that many insurance policyholders in the city of San Francisco didn't have coverage for earthquakes, but they did have coverage for fire. Soon, people began lighting their earthquake damaged homes and businesses alight, making the job of the Army and San Francisco Fire Department that much harder. In the end, up to 90% of the damage done to the city of San Francisco as a result of the earthquake was caused by the ensuing fires and not the earthquake itself. It is unknown what percentage of those were deliberately set. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake is the deadliest in U.S. history. More than 3,000 people lost their lives and more than 227,000 were made homeless. 80% of the city was destroyed. Almost immediately, however, recovery and reconstruction efforts began. Bank of America, then known as the Bank of Italy, pitched in with funds that they had evacuated days earlier. Almost all other major banks in the area had been devastated by the fires, however, necessitating a lengthy wait while their fireproof vaults cooled down enough in order to be opened. This disaster changed the face of San Francisco and the American West. Those changes can still be felt today. Today, we know Los Angeles as the biggest city in California, but it was not always this way. San Francisco became the center of economic activity in the American West following the gold rush, and probably would have continued this way had the events of 1906 not played out the way they did. In a 2020 study by the University of Denmark, it's theorized that the 1906 earthquake interfered with long established migration chains. When people consider moving somewhere for work, they often prefer to settle near friends, family, and representative cultural groups. This is known as chain migration. After the 1906 earthquake, so many people were displaced or killed that these groups began to dissipate into other parts of California and surrounding states. However, that didn't stop resident Chinese immigrants who, after the City Hall and Hall of Records burned, seized the opportunity to claim citizenship and residence in the area for themselves, for relatives, or for friends. Since there were no records that could prove otherwise, they were often allowed to receive replacement papers for the ones lost in the fires, even if they weren't actually U.S. citizens. Even more interesting than the effect on migration that the 1906 earthquake had was its effect on the world economy. As it turns out, most of the insurance companies that held policies on the buildings in San Francisco back in 1906 were based in England. Since the gold standard was very much a thing back then, when money needed to flow between continents, so did gold. According to one study, it's estimated that something like 14% of England's total gold stocks went overseas to the US to settle insurance claims from the fires and the earthquake. This understandably got the Bank of England pretty spooked, and they needed to raise interest rates by a whopping 2.5% in the latter part of 1906 in order to encourage investors and businesses to keep their gold in England. In addition, they began taking punitive measures against American companies, limiting their access to credit and financing. This led to one of the shortest but most severe recessions in American history, called the Panic of 1907 or the Rich Man's Panic. The New York Stock Exchange fell about 50% from its peak. There were bank runs, bankruptcies, and the high profile shuttering of a major New York investment bank called the Knickerbocker Trust. So, a number of New York bankers with access to cash, among them financier JP Morgan, pledged to be a lender of last resort to the distressed banks, effectively averting the crisis. Following the panic, some of those same lenders of last resort, most prominently among them partners of JP Morgan, got together and drew up plans for implementing what would become the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. History is rife with examples of events or disasters that have outsized effects when multiplied by the passing of decades and centuries. San Francisco's earthquake is one of these, having played a defining role in not only the local economic activity of the American West, but also the creation of one of the pillars of today's modern economy, the Federal Reserve banking system. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll stick around for more content like this.